Hi there. This is the first video in the Saddle Up Sunshine series where I'm going to be talking about Gideon the Ninth, Hero the Ninth, and Nona the Ninth. So this first video is for Act 1 of Gideon the Ninth. And I've been trying to figure out how I want to do this because I have filmed this multiple times, and each time it's come out to over an hour. And it's just too much. And the last one was even just the first 3 chapters, not even the first act. So I'm going to start this off by saying I did go ahead and make a Discord. I've never used Discord before. It looks a lot like Slack to me. So I went ahead and tried and I made it, and I will have the link in the description below. Feel free to join it. It might make it easier for me to do this next one if I chat to other people about it throughout. There is a read along on Storygraph. It's not very active. I've been the only one who's posted anything. A few people have joined it, have DNF'd the book, and one person has finished it already and rated it with no interaction with the group. So I think read-alongs on Storygraph are a new function, so I don't know if people that are joining them really know what they want to do with them. I don't know what I want to post in it, so I went ahead and made the Discord. So this is the first announcement of that. The link is down below in the description. And be gentle with me. I am still trying to figure out how to use it. So any advice in the Discord, drop me a comment here, any advice on how to use it is accepted because I'm a grandma, apparently. Okay, that out of the way. There's a lot of different layers of what we could talk about in this first act. So Gideon the Ninth is broke up into 5 acts, and they're all of varying lengths. And the first act really serves for world building and character introduction and setting up the plot and what we're going to be experiencing in the book. And I think it does a really good job of it. And I'd written a bunch of stuff out, but I think it just works better if I just talk. I think that works better for me. So characterization is essentially just describing a character, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do that, and that's direct or indirect. Direct characterization is when the author tells us what a character is like. This character is happy. This character has blue eyes. This character is wearing a blue shirt. That is direct characterization. There's indirect characterization where the author shows us about the character, and we get to know their personality through their actions, their reactions, their dialogue, and their physical description. So there is a bit of direct in the way that you can describe, that you can do characterization. And for some people, it's really important to have a character described to you. Other books don't do it. One of the things I've heard recently about John Scalzi's Kaiju Preservation Society is that the main character is never described, which I think is really interesting and really makes me want to move that book up higher on my list. So, but that's for another conversation. So Tamsyn Muir, I think, has done a really good job of characterizing Gideon for us. And I think I just want to talk about Gideon in this video. And perhaps I'll do another one where I talk about Hero in the next one. But for this one, we start the book with, and I have it right here, so maybe I'll just pull it out because I have so much stuff highlighted. I'm going to show you everything I have tabbed. So this is only in the first 86 pages. I've used quite a bit of my tabs. So I have a code for tabbing while I'm doing this. So I guess I can share how I've been doing it. So I have this notebook. I ordered my stickers like 2 weeks ago and they haven't arrived yet. So hopefully they arrive soon. So this is the colors I'm using. And so I've got this light orange for characterization, this middle orange for plot and world building, and this gray for quotes and also just descriptions that I think are really interesting, and kind of some of them is descriptions of note is what I've called them. And so one of the things I've been doing it with that gray has been highlighting all of the different names for the Emperor Undying. So this has kind of helped me organize my thoughts a little bit, and I'm already like a good chunk into this notebook too. And I still have more stuff to fill in. So I have finished the first act. Act 1 goes for a good 86 pages if you're in the hardback version that I have. Gideon's the titular character. Let's talk about Gideon. We have the Ninth House, which are the keepers of the locked tomb, House of the Sewn Tongue, the Black Vestals. So we have a list of everyone who is part of the house, and at the very end it says, and Gideon Nav, indentured servant of the Ninth House. So Gideon is living on the Ninth, but she's not of the Ninth. Okay, so the first sentence of this book introduces us to Gideon and who she is as a character. In the myriadic year of our Lord, the 10,000th year of the King Undying, the kindly Prince of Death, Gideon Nav packed her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, and she escaped from the House of the Ninth. So in this description of Gideon, we have a list of things that are important to her, because these are what she's taking during her escape, and also kind of the implication that she doesn't have a lot of things, because if all she's taking to escape is her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, it gives us the implication that she doesn't have a lot of things, or a lot of things that are of importance to her. And then it says that she escaped from the House of the Ninth. These gives us questions about Gideon that we want answered. Why is she escaping? What is the Ninth? How is she going to do it? Where is she going to go? And it says that she escaped, so that implies to us that this is going to be successful, by saying that she escaped from the House of the Ninth. And then it says she didn't run. Gideon never ran unless she had to. So this could imply to us that Gideon is thoughtful, meticulous, and intentional with her actions. Giving us that, it's either Gideon is lazy or Gideon is thoughtful and intentional with her actions. And then right after that, we have that a description of how she went so far as to sweep the dust off the floor of her cell, which kind of continues to imply that Gideon is intentional with her actions and she's purposefully trying to take her time with this and do it right. And then we get this whole thing about how Gideon goes out to where the shuttle's going to land and she kicks over all the clods of dirt. And so this gives us again that either Gideon is very thoughtful and intentional with her actions and very thorough, or she's very paranoid about something happening. So we get more of the description of the day. Gideon waits for her shuttle. That's how she's going to leave. She's going to join the military so that she can get out of her indentured servitude. And we have Crux, the marshal of the house, appear in a very threatening manner. And he's described as being really gross and disgusting and old as balls is one of the ways that Gideon describes him. She very much doesn't like him and he very much doesn't like her. So we get a little bit of Gideon's personality through the interactions. She sasses him immediately. She coaxes him and teases him and taunts him both in her inner monologue and in her outer monologue. With sentences like, she offers to trade a skin mag, frontline titties of the 5th. She says that she'll trade it for him to just let her go, let her get on the shuttle. And it says this rendered the marshal momentarily too aghast to respond. And so Gideon, knowing the reason that he wouldn't respond is because he's very insulted by her offer of a dirty magazine. But she responds as if he's affronted that she's offered him something that's not even real, because she says, okay, I take it back. Frontline Titties isn't a real publication. And she just continues to act this way towards him. And in the audiobook, which I'm also using the audiobook once, I read it really fast in the audiobook and then I come back and read it physically as well. So that way I have like a full idea of what's happening and then I can like really read it. It's taking a lot longer, but it's giving me a lot of like context for things. So in the voice, she's very sassy about it, very sarcastic. So we get a lot of that through the word choice here too. When she finally convinces Crux to leave, she's surprised that he leaves. Crux was an impotent symbol of control. One last attempt to test if she was stupid enough or cowed enough to walk back behind the cold bars of her prison. And so the fact that he left is like a whole thing to her. She's like, I've already won. It says Gideon was home free, Gideon was gone, and nothing, and nobody could change that now. And then we have Aglamene come in, and we get a very different side of Gideon with the way that she interacts with Aglamene. She describes her as dragging herself into the small light of the landing where Crux stumped in. So she describes him as stumping and Aglamene as dragging. And then Aglamene leg bowed horribly, and it gave her the appearance of a building with the foundations hastily shored up, where Crux is described as decrepit and molding and long past his expiration date, essentially. And Aglamene is also described as old, but it says that she has a quickness to her, a liveliness that was clean. The marshal, Crux, it was classic Ninth, and he was filthy rotten all the way through. So she views Aglamene in a much nicer light than she views Crux. And Aglamene views her in a much nicer light than Crux views her as well. So we have kind of a different interaction between the two of them. And Gideon's sass is still there a little bit, but not as much, where she whines and complains to Aglamene, the captain, over and over about how unfair Harrow is and how this isn't something that she deserves. She's tried to join the military 33 times, and Harrow, which we just get referred to as the lady right now, has stopped them every single time. And that now there's been a muster called simply so that Gideon can't leave. And Aglamene says, "You egotistical fetus, you think Our Lady rang the muster call just for you?" And Gideon turns that back to her and she says, "So here's the thing, your lady," she doesn't say Our Lady, it's your lady. "Your lady would set the locked tomb on fire if it meant I'd never see another sky. Your lady would stone cold eat a baby if it meant she got to lock me up infinitely. Your lady would slather burning turds on the great ants if she thought it would ruin my day. Your lady is the nastiest," and then she gets cut off before she can call her a bitch by Aglamene slapping her. And Aglamene says, It says, Aglamene slapped her. It had none of the trembling affrontedness Crux might have had. Crux might have slapped her with. She simply backhanded Gideon the way you might hit a barking animal, and Gideon's head was starry with pain. So we get this very, like, different descriptions in the behavior of the two elder people that Gideon has interacted with so far. And then she says, you forget yourself, Gideon Nav. You're no slave, but you'll serve the house of the Ninth until the day you die, and then thereafter, and you'll commit no sin of perfidy in my heir. So I had to look it up. Perfidy is deceitfulness. Aglamene asks her basically, like, will you come to this muster or will you disgrace me? And Gideon has this whole inner monologue about how Aglamene is the only one that ever took a chance on her. She didn't have any, she says there was no tenderness felt between them, but Aglamene was more tolerant, a measure of willingness to give Gideon some freedom, and that Gideon loved freedom. And then it says that Aglamene gave her the sword, and Gideon loved her sword so much she could friggin' marry it. So while there's no affection, we're told there's no affection between the two. The things that Aglamene has given Gideon, Gideon loves. And this kind of gives us a little bit of an idea that Gideon's putting up this big front of being not bothered by things and retaining her sarcasm and her sense of humor. And it kind of tells us that she's using it as a shield, and that there is more of a tenderness to Gideon than we're getting told at the moment because of the way she feels towards the things that Aglamene has given her. These things give us a hint of what kind of person lies underneath the exterior of Gideon that we could potentially see as the book goes on. And then she has, after all these thoughts, she says, I guess I'll disgrace you, Gideon admitted easily. I feel like I was born to it. I'm naturally demeaning. And again, this is after Gideon's thought about how she had to pause because she didn't want to disgrace Aglamene. And it says that it would be easy to disgrace in a vacuum, but she had a soft spot for the old soldier. And then at the end of her thought, you didn't cut loose by getting soft. For all its moldering brittleness, the Ninth was hard as iron. So Gideon's like, if I need to leave this place, I need to be as hard as this place. And that again gives us this other implication that Gideon is hard on the outside because she has to be to survive in this cold place. And when Aglamene leaves, she says, such a quick study and you still don't understand. The more you struggle against the Ninth Nav, the deeper it takes you. The louder you curse it, the louder they'll have you scream. And then she leaves, and Gideon feels like she's failed a test. And when Crux left, she was just like, yeah, you go, get out of here. And when Aglamene leaves, she's like, oh, fucked up. After this, we get some backstory on Gideon for the last bit of this chapter. We're still in the first chapter, and we've learned this much about our main character. And so in the end of this first chapter, we learn that Gideon's mother, Gideon's not from the Ninth, but is not of the Ninth, but she's from the Ninth. So she was not born here. Her family is not from here. And that's a little unusual for children in this planet, I believe. But Gideon's mother fell from the sky, and at first they thought she might have fallen from the prison, but the prison keeps very good records. So there's a prison above the castle, and suspended in the air in this bubble is a prison for the nastiest criminals in all the 9 houses. They all come to Drirba, basically. They come to live above Castle Drirba, and they thought at first she was from there, but the prison keeps very good records, and there was no list of escapee. No one knows where she came from, but she had a little bio container attached to her spacesuit, and her mother was dead, and Gideon was alive in the bio container, and then the nuns were able to speak to her spirit, and all she was screamed the name Gideon over and over, and then her spirit disappeared. So she got the name Gideon, and she was indentured to the house for the debt of her raising. And then it says that there were, at the time, the tiny Ninth house, boasted 200 children between infancy and 19 years of age, and Gideon was numbered 201st. Less than 2 years later, Gideon Nav would be one of only 3 children left, herself a much older boy, and the infant heir of the Ninth house, daughter of his lord and lady. So Gideon survived whatever caused the rest of these kids to die, as well as one older boy and Harrow. So now in chapter 2, we get to meet Harrow. And the way that Harrow is introduced, so at this point, I'm gonna stop and say the voice of the narrator is definitely taken on Gideon's voice. So at this point, we get Harrow introduced, and to Gideon, she describes her as, I'm just gonna read this little paragraph. The lady of the Ninth house stood before the drill shaft, wearing black and sneering. Reverend daughter Harrow Hark, known as Gesimus, had pretty much cornered the market on wearing black and sneering. It comprised 100% of her personality. Gideon marveled that someone could live in the universe only 17 years and yet wear black and sneer with such ancient self-assurance. And their interactions tell us a lot about Gideon. So Harrow is a necromancer, and we learn in this chapter that she basically calls up bones and to build full skeletons, and she's amazing at it, really. She's one of the best, especially for her age. And she uses this to trick Gideon. And Gideon tells her that before Gideon knows about the trick, she tells her that she completely fucking hates her and that's why she needs to leave. Harrow's like, let's make a deal, okay? A fair fight. So she takes off all of her bone jewelry that she wears, and Gideon's like, only an asshole would agree to this fair fight. So I'm gonna agree. Because, like, she's fully aware that what she's doing is really shitty, but she's gonna do it anyway because she wants to leave so bad. And at one point, she even makes a comment that she sees Harrow for what she really was, a desperate girl younger than Gideon and rather small and feeble. And so Gideon does, again, we're seeing inside to this, like, this is just this small, feeble girl. I would be a complete dick if I agreed to fight her on these terms where she has no weapon. And yet she agrees anyway. And all she was going to do is she gets Harrow to agree that the winner it's to the ground. So whoever pins the other one first, basically. So she's like, a quick kick to the chest, and then I'll sit on her if I have to keep her down long enough. She's not planning on physically hurting her because she's so much bigger than this girl. And she sees herself as that way. And even in this little bit, there's a joke where Aglamene is like, take back your honor and give your lady a weapon. Gideon couldn't help herself. Are you asking me to throw her a bone? To give it a sense of humor. So now we've got a little bit, we're just continuing that in all of these situations, Gideon has zero fear. She's not afraid of any of this, and she's just going to continue to make jokes and be sarcastic. That is her personality. And when Aglamene yells at her Nav, she yells, Nav, Gideon replies, I gave her my whole life. And so this is Gideon's chance to leave, to take her life back. And then Harrow tricks her, and she calls up all these bones in the ground. And Harrow has already told her, I never think about you. But then it's revealed that Harrow spent the entire night digging in the shuttle landing area to bury bones. So there's one line in here. So when all the bones start coming up from the ground, these fingers start like popping up. It says, she dropped the gloves and wiggled her fingers in Gideon's direction, and Gideon had a split second to realize that it was drill shaft grit in Harrow's hand, and like under her fingernails and stuff, and that she was absolutely boned in all directions. And I love this phrasing. This is one of the things I want to talk about. Like, this phrasing, Tamsyn has basically been like, I can use this word because Harrow is boned means that Harrow is actually like weaponed from all directions, right? Because Harrow uses bones as her weapons. But also Gideon is boned in all directions because Gideon's getting fucked from every direction. And it's one of those phrasings that I'm like, Tamsyn, this is so good. There's a little bit about Harrow, basically. Harrow wins. Gideon's on the ground, and Harrow walks up and kicks her in the face. Just for the fun of kicking her in the face. So Harrow wants Gideon to get drug into the muster. So Gideon goes to the muster, and she's sitting there watching. And as much as she hates being there, there's a little bit of drama happening during this announcement. And Gideon starts settling in, like, yeah, this is kind of fun to watch, right? Because everyone starts getting upset because Harrow reveals, this is where we get the first plot point, like, really revealed. Harrow has been invited to the first to try to become a lictor, and lictors serve the Emperor undying. There's so much, honestly, I'm still at chapter 3. There's so much in here. So we get more about Gideon where she's just kind of watching this all unfold. Everyone starts arguing, and in the argument, Ortis Niganad, who is the cavalier of the Ninth House, is supposed to go with Harrow to the first so that Harrow can achieve lictorhood, and his mom loses her shit and assumes that Ortis could die, and even though he's 35, so he was the older boy who survived. So these three are the youngest people on the planet. And so he survived, and his mom wants to keep it that way. So she doesn't want him to go to help Harrow achieve lictorhood because she's worried he could die. So after Harrow just tells everyone to just fuck off, they slip out, and Aglamene stops to give Gideon her sword, and Gideon's like, right, I'm gonna go get on my ship. And she like tells Harrow, she's like, oh, I figured out your trick. And Harrow's like, what, with the shuttle? And Gideon's like, what about the shuttle? And Harrow's like, oh, Ortis took it, and his mom, they've escaped. And Harrow laughs at her at that she makes it so easy. She's like, you make it so easy, Griddle, you always do. Gideon had never confronted a broken heart before. She had never gotten far enough to have her heart broken. This is the closest escape she's ever gotten, and she's just completely destroyed. A great dullness had sunk over her, a deep coldness, a thick stolidity. When her heart beat in her chest, it was a huge, steady grief. Every pulse seemed to be the space between insensibility and knives. And that's basically how this chapter ends, with Gideon just like, why? And Harrow says, because I completely fucking hate you. No offense. Which is exactly what Gideon said to Harrow. Chapter 4, we open up with, it would have been neater perhaps if all of Gideon's disappointments and woes from birth downward had used that moment as a catalyst. If filled with a new and fiery determination, she had equipped herself down there in the dark with fresh ambition to become free. She didn't. She got the depression. So we have more of like a description of how Gideon deals with this. She's just kind of like ambling around her cell. She's eating paste instead of food, despite the fact that most of the food on the Ninth is pasty anyway. And then she's doing she's still exercising though, because that's what Gideon does. So she's still exercising, she's just doing it in the dark. Harrow comes and darkens her doorway, and Gideon says, "Fuck you," and switch to push-ups. To which Harrow says, "Stop sulking, Griddle." And Gideon replies, "Go choke on a dick." And then Harrow offers her a task. And after some back and forth where we get Gideon, who we've learned is at this point fairly wordy, even when she doesn't want to be. Because Harrow says, "I have work for you." And Gideon replies, "Nona Gesimus," she said slowly, "the only job I'd do for you would be if you wanted someone to hold the sword as you fell on it. The only job I'd do for you would be if you wanted your ass kicked so hard the locked tomb opened and a parade came out to sing, 'Lo, a distracted ass.' The only job I'd do would be if you wanted me to spot you while you backflipped off the top tier into Driva." "That's 3 jobs," said Harrow Hark. "Die in a fire, Nona Gesimus," is Gideon's reply. So we have Gideon she's still pissed. But then Harrow convinces her to come down to the catacombs with her. And it's because all of that happened, and Gideon thinks maybe there's still a way, because she's nothing if not hopeful. So she gets her down to the catacombs where they come across Aglamene, and we again get some of these great interactions between Gideon and Aglamene, where Aglamene is being somewhat nice to her in very backhanded ways. And she says in another chapter that Aglamene would never speak to a word to Gideon that didn't have an edge on it. And so she knows this, she knows how to accept it, but she's good at reading between the lines at what is meant by what Aglamene says, even the backhanded compliments about her sword fighting. So in here we learn that Gideon's really good with her sword, but she's not very good with any other type of weapon. But Aglamene thinks she can teach her because she is so good with it. And at the end of this chapter, Gideon's like, "I still don't think I want to do this, because since Ortis is gone, Gideon is going to become the Cavalier." And a Cavalier is basically the knight, the highest honor of the house, as she's the highest knight in the house. So she's going to accompany Harrow to the first at the whim of the Emperor, the King Undying, the kindly Prince of Death, to help Harrow achieve lictorhood. And she doesn't want to do this because she's pretty sure Harrow is going to be a tyrant. And she's like, the last thing I want to do is help a tyrant rise to power. So but Aglamene is like, "Do this, Gideon, because this is your last chance. This is your only chance out. We both know if you don't go, you'll never leave." And so at the urging of Aglamene, to the better of her judgment, she agrees to go with Harrow. And that's basically where this chapter ends. We get more of these quips. Even though she doesn't want to do this and she's really unhappy about it, she's still being like quippy about everything, and she's still retaining that personality that we got introduced to in the beginning, which gives us more of an indication that personality is a shield. Chapter 5, that's basically chapter 4, is Gideon getting her rapier, and Aglamene being like, "I have 3 months to make you a semi-believable Cavalier." So, because since Gideon doesn't have the lineage, she shouldn't be a Cavalier. And chapter 5 is a very short one. We get more of Gideon and Harrow interacting. And Gideon is now going to have to start wearing the skull makeup that every adept of the Ninth and every nun of the Ninth wears. And she's really upset about it. She hates wearing it. 10,000 years of tradition, Griddle. And Gideon's like, "I don't have 10,000 years of tradition, bitch. I have 10 years of two-hander training and a minor allergy to face paint. I'm worth so much less to you with pizza face and a toothpick." And they basically continue to argue about this. And Harrow continues to give her instruction on how she's going to behave and that she's going to do this. And she says, this is the house of the Ninth, Griddle. We act accordingly. Act accordingly meant that any attempt to talk to an outsider as a kid had led to her getting dragged away bodily. Act accordingly meant the house had been closed to pilgrims for 5 years. Act accordingly had been her secret dread that 10 years from now, everyone else would be skeletons and explorers would find Ortis reading poetry next to her and Harrow's bodies, their fingers still clasped around each other's throats. Act accordingly to Gideon meant being secret and abstruse and being super obsessed with tomes. So Gideon doesn't fit in here, and Gideon doesn't want to fit in here, and Gideon doesn't want to act accordingly. Chapter 6, I called it the training montage. Our main thing that we learn in here is that Gideon wants to know what's going to happen, and so she continues to perform. Even one of her training things is to follow Harrow around all day and just be silent. And she says the best part of this is that she gets to pick up a little bit of things that Harrow's saying in front of her without caring that Gideon's there, that she can manage to pick up. So again, another really short chapter, and really all we get from here is that Gideon really wants to know what's going to happen. So Gideon's a very inquisitive person, and she's trying really hard to learn this rapier, but she's really struggling with it. That's pretty much what we continue to learn in this one. And then at the end of the chapter, they leave, and there's a really interesting thing that some really good foreshadowing. So I'm gonna have to make another thing to talk about the foreshadowing at some point. And then Harrow gets a little emotional as they're like leaving the shuttle, and Gideon's like, "Do you want my hanky?" Harrow replies, "I want to watch you die." And Gideon replies, "Maybe, Nona Gesimus," she said with deep satisfaction. "Maybe, but you sure as hell won't do it here." So things start to change a little bit in chapter 7. So chapter 7 is mostly an introduction to Canaan House, but we also get a little bit about Gideon. Gideon gets her aviators in this chapter, and I love it. So the 9th is very dark, very dark. They only have artificial lighting, all this stuff. And the 1st is a little more like our world. Very bright sun, lots of water, and Gideon and Harrow's eyes aren't accustomed to actual light. And so Harrow has like a veil, like a couple of veils tied around her eyes, and she offers to Gideon, and Gideon's like, "No, because I found these in Drirba," and they're aviators. And Harrow's just like pissed off about it, but she just lets Gideon do it. And they fit Gideon's personality perfectly. So we get a lot of introduction to other people that are going to be there, but one of my favorite things is we get Gideon's, because I said the narrator is starting to come through Gideon's voice, and we get descriptions of other people. So this one is, Gideon was hugely interested to see 3 figures emerge. This is for the 3rd house. The first was a rather sulky young man with an air of hair gel and filigree, an ornate rapier at the belt of his buttoned coat. The cavalier. The other 2 were young women, both blonde, though the similarity ended there. One girl was tall and statuesque, with a star-white grin and masses of bright curls. The other seemed smaller, insubstantial, with a sheet of hair the anemic color of canned butter, and an equally bloodless smirk. They were actually the same height, Gideon realized. Her brain had just deemed that proposition too stupid to credit on first pass. It was as though the second girl were the starved shadow of the first, or the first an illuminated reflection. The boy just looked a bit of a dick. And so we're getting characterizations of people through Gideon's lens now, and I really like that aspect, because we get how Gideon makes first impressions of people, and she seems to clue in on their ego and whether she deems them weak or not. We get Gideon, the one time Gideon runs. So when the 7th house lands, it says the figure was dragging on the ground, threatening to spill entirely. There was red blood on the priest's front. He cried out. Gideon never ran unless she had to, and Gideon ran now. Her legs moved as swiftly as her awful judgment, and all of a sudden she was scooping the crumpled, drooping figure out of the priest's buckling arms, lowering his cargo to the ground as he murmured in amazement. So Gideon is, again, this gives us an extra layer. Gideon's willing to be a hero for other people. Gideon is a little soft on the inside. Or Gideon has an ego that she needs filled, and that's why she's done it. So one of those 2 things together, it gives us some extra information. So she grabs this woman who's fainted dead away, and then she gets a sword stuck in the back of her, a rapier in the back of her head as a threat, basically. And Harrow gets the threat away, and then Gideon's like, "Oh fuck, but Harrow's going to be worse later." So I really love this description of Dulcinea, like how we get introduced to Dulcinea Septimus, who is the Duchess of the 7th. And I might have to do like one of these for like other characters, but so Dulcinea, I love her, and I love the voice that Moira Quirk gave her. It's just so good. So the priest asks, I'm just gonna say this because I just love this. The priest is like, "You shouldn't have come, you're so sick," and he's like, "You shouldn't have come," and she flashes him a smile, and she's like, "But isn't it beautiful that I did?" Like, I just love her so much. Like, in the introduction is just, she's like enamored that she's been saved by a tomb maiden, and she's just like, "Oh my god," like she's just that like kind of fainting, like the fainting Victorian woman, and it's so entertaining. There's one point where Gideon's like, oh, but you, because she's like, oh, look at me making a fool of myself, and she's like, you fainted, and she's like, I do that. Like, it's just like Dulcinea. Like, and so Gideon describes the Cavalier of the Seventh as great rugged arms thrust past Gideon's vision, and the girl in her lap was lifted up by a 6-foot collection of sinews. The man who'd put the sword on her neck was uncomfortably buff. He had upsetting biceps. He didn't look healthy. He looked like a collection of lemons in a sack. He was a dour, bulky person whose skin had something of the girl's strange translucent tinge. He was waxen looking in the sunlight, probably with sweat, and he wore the girl half draped over his shoulder as though she were a baby or a rug. Gideon sized him up. He was dressed richly, but with clothes that looked as though they'd seen practical wear. A long cape of washed-out green, a belted kilt, and boots. There was a shining length of etched chain rolled up over his arm, and a big, swept hilt rapier hung at his hip. He was staring at Gideon emptily. You're gigantic, she thought, but you move awkwardly, and I bet I could take you. So Gideon is just deciding with all of these people as she sees them whether or not they're a threat, and whether or not she could take them in a fight, because that's her personality. That's how she views the world. So we get a little bit more, this is Protesilaus, we get a little bit more about him as the chapter goes on, and just more of Gideon's like observances of him. And we can already tell Gideon's a little taken with Dulcinea, and it could be because she saved her or because the lady looks so weak, because as we already know, Gideon is just a soft girl on the inside. That is chapter 7, basically. Chapter 8 is really interesting. I call it a very gothic house. We just get introduced to the house mostly, and we get a little bit of Gideon learning about the other people in the house, and about that their religion on the Ninth is different, and how Gideon takes to that. One of the things that I enjoyed was when they got sent to their rooms, the shuttles, they basically get told, like, there's no contact with the outside world while you're here. And then Gideon falls asleep to watching the shuttles getting dropped into the sea, and she's just like, and goes to sleep. Like, she doesn't care if she gets to leave here or not, because she's not in the Ninth anymore. So that is where we're at, and I think the next one, I'll probably talk a little bit more about something else. I don't know, but that's the end of Act 1. I just really wanted to talk about characterization and how much Tamsyn has done to develop this character in this first act. There's other characters like developed, but really it's just teaching us who Griddle is. And I think it sets up a story in a way that is so different than any book that I've read. I love character-driven books, like, a lot. And I think this one is definitely one of the higher up on my list as far as how it's driven, because it is character-driven, but it's also plot-driven. The first act is very heavy on the characters, but we still have things moving and things in motion. I have lots of other tabs here for world building and plot, and, like, it is set up so well. There are so many things in here that when we get to the end, I want to talk about, because we set up for the ending. We were told the ending in the beginning of this book, and I just love that. So, if you have any opinions on Griddle and any thoughts on any of this at all, or if there's anything that you think it would be interesting for me to talk about before we finish reading Act 2, let me know, because I can start trying to do shorter videos on this, because I really think there's just so much in here that it's so hard to just talk about one thing at a time, and it's so hard to keep these short. This is going to be long already, and I've only talked about character development. So, who's your favorite character? That's my question. If you made it this far into the video, tell me in the comments if you've read this, whether in the first act, if you preferred Harrow or Gideon, or maybe Aglavene. Let me know.